Hey, this is Damon, Garcia, and you're listening to Everyone is Talking About God. And we're in the middle of this series, God After Sovereignty. And we're talking a tad delay today. Get into it. What's up, everyone? Welcome back to the podcast. I'm back here. It's Damon with Gabby.
Hello.
What's up, Gabby? Oh my goodness. We just moved her giant tortoise, actually.
Yeah, it's just why we're kind of out of breath.
I know. Yeah, it's extremely heavy. But today we're continuing our series on God After Sovereignty. And I interviewed Tad DeLay. Tad DeLay is our first return guest ever. We had him on to talk about his book, The Cynic and the Fool, before, so go check out that episode, and we went deep into his background and story too. This time we just purely talk about his perspective and ideas on this concept of God without sovereignty and after sovereignty. And first off, let me just say, he's the author of The Cynic and the Fool, The Unconscious in Theology and Politics, and he's the author of God is Unconscious, Psychoanalysis and Theology. And he's got a PhD in religion, an MA in philosophy, an MA in theology, and a BA in psychology. And he lives and teaches in Denver, and he aims to make theory public, which is what I really like about Tad, because he knows a lot, and he can easily just write books just for other scholars, but he writes books for us too.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
Wow.
And before we get into it, I just want to also say one of the reasons I love him is because he, in talking about psychoanalysis, talks a lot about the unconscious, which is this part of ourselves where it's where we really see what we believe, because there's the things that we say about how we see the world and why we make the decisions we do. But then there's, beneath all that, the really real reasons why we do what we do that we may not even know or realize. And that also plays into the belief in God. Even though plenty of people can say, I don't believe in God, clearly they're still believing in something like it. Like the classic example I see all the time is people who say they don't believe in God, but just say the universe. They just replace the word with the universe. Have you seen that, Gabby?
Oh, yes. All the time. I mean, well, and I think there's to a certain extent, people who do that haven't quite gone deeply into that realm yet. Mm-hmm. So I feel like those are maybe more new people to that type of way of talking about God, because I think once you go, at least for my journey, and I've seen a lot of people in my community's journey into that route, at first you're forget God, the universe, that feels way better. Yeah. And then you go down the path and you're like, oh shit, it's all the same. It's all the same thing. But then it makes it cool because you can have conversations with anybody and relate. Right. So yeah, I feel like it's almost like a premature, people who do that, are just babies in the path of that. And it kind of cycles back, you know?
Yeah. And then there's also on the other side of supernatural things and the idea of evil and demonic stuff and all that. I love this old video by this magician and comedian Darren Brown, where he got in a room surrounded by atheists who all claim they don't believe in anything supernatural or paranormal, any of that. And he brought out the Satanic Bible, and in there was a ritual for how to sell your soul to the devil. And he had every person in the crowd bring a picture of their loved one. And according to the ritual, you had to stab the picture of your loved one and then read this ritual. And he said, so since we all don't believe this, who wants to do this? and none of them wanted to do it. I think like 2 people out of like 100 were like, sure, I'll try it. But I love that video because it shows that even when people say they don't believe, there's something else going on underneath all of it. There's plenty of people who say they don't believe in ghosts or demons, but will still never go to a haunted house. And plenty of people who say, I don't believe in God, but will still pray when they're suffering.
Yeah. And then that's interesting with like, because some people might be like, well, I don't want to go to a haunted house because it makes me scared and fearful, and I don't want to be scared and fearful. But like those emotions are like innate beliefs. You believe that you are that thing. You believe in something. You believe in being another way of your being, or way, like you can evoke emotion, and it's kind of similar in belief system. Like you can evoke belief. It's like he said in the interview, like as long as there are words, there's God or something. Or,
in quoting Lacan is like, as long as things are said, we will always believe in God. Yeah. And
brings me back to that.
Yeah, and I just saw this meme this week of this tweet of this guy that reminds me of this whole idea of this God, this sovereign God that even when we say we don't believe it, we still kind of fall back on. Of this, it is hilarious. Of course, it's sarcastic, but I love it. He's like, I asked God for $1,000 and said I would go to church this Sunday. Guess who won $1,000 off a $1 ticket? And I'm not going to church. Finessed him. I love that because like growing up, the way I was taught about God, me and so many other people I know grew up saying things like, God, if this happens, then I'll go to church, or I'll read the Bible this week, or I'll do this for you if you do this for me. And it's just, when you think about it, when I read a tweet like that, you kind of realize how weird and ridiculous that is.
Yeah. Well, and I mean, that totally plays into the doing something for the desire of the other person.
Yes, which Tad gets into as well.
Yeah, which, man, that is such a thing I could go on for days about. But it's like, it's kind of incredible because, like he was saying, the baby looks in the mirror and then has to look back at the other, what's it called? What is it called? The big other, for affirmation. And we do that our whole lives. We're, looking for others for affirmation, and then like leading that into when you only do stuff for the desire of someone else. That's like an abusive relationship.
Yes.
And tying that into religion, like it makes the interpretation of God through that view would be kind of abusive, because if you're only doing something for a desire of somebody that you perceive their desires to, and hold those above your own for everything, like you kind of are having an abusive relationship with God there.
Definitely.
And you're defining that. Like, it's not to say that God is abusive or whatever, but maybe the sovereign God that you're perceiving and creating a relationship with could be. But it's choice and perception is all really key in those things, which that's up to us.
Definitely. So that's what we're doing in this whole series, is deconstructing a lot of what we may have been told about whatever God is, and talking about new ways to talk about God. So let's get into this interview, and we're going to keep talking way more after. Get into it. Okay, we're joined once again with Tad Delay through Skype from Denver, Colorado. And I'm not going to front, we're actually recording this episode right after we recorded the last one. He's
great to see you again. It's been so long. Yes.
He's kind enough to do 2 episodes in a row. But it's because I love your perspective on a lot of things, and you study a wide variety of things with politics, psychoanalysis, theology, which I really relate with. And on this podcast, we try to talk about a wide variety of things because...
Oh, very good.
Yeah, because theology covers a whole lot of things. And I know you like the quote from Carl Schmitt where he says, today everything is theological with the exception of what the theologians talk about.
Right, yeah.
Can you tell us what you think about that quote?
Yeah, I mean, that kind of gets to that. The way that the word theology gets used after, well, I don't know exactly who we can blame for this, but definitely Marx represents kind of a moment in this where he talks about like the theological dimension of money, right? Or the theological dimension of the commodity. That is to say that we treat it as if it is this object that we are psychologically invested into to provide us with some sort of meaning or coherence or whatever else, right? And we don't say we worship money, but yes, of course we do, right? Yeah. Or commodities or whatnot. So that's kind of the side. So for the last few hundred years, we've used theology even more consciously to mean a lot of different things, right? Like I kind of define it as like a psychological investment into creeds, symbols, rituals, persons, whatever, right? But like thinking of theology is really about thinking of a type of psychological investment into objects, right? Or fictions or symbols or whatever else. But yeah, so I do love that Carl Schmitt quote. It was in a letter to Jakob Taubes. He was a Jewish thinker who spent a lot of time thinking about St. Paul, actually, but they had a very close correspondence, and they So in that letter, he's telling him everything today is theological except for whatever the theologians are talking about, and I think that's so great because like you look at like what contemporary theology is, and it's all just so boring. Like it was like Tillich is like the last proper theologian that I find interesting, right? Like in sort of like systematic, like traditional iterations. And then like after that, like anybody who's interesting after that is doing something kind of deviating from the norm, right? Like from sort of the white Western traditional norm, right? So like after that, you have to look at like like the James Cone character, or like queer theology or feminist thought or whatever else to find interesting theological thoughts. But yeah, so we kind of we bump up against this moment right up against like where he's writing that sentence, where I also find like traditional theology to just not be interesting whatsoever anymore. So
yeah, I relate with that. I definitely relate.
So,
and yeah, I think there's so much more to talk about too, and that's. Yeah. And I also wanted to ask you, would you say that you personally believe in something that maybe could be called God sometimes?
Yeah, I get my students ask me this question a lot, actually, so I get a lot of practice answering this question. My honest answer is I try not to. But like also kind of psychoanalysis is kind of like premises on the idea that you don't really get that much say in what you think, right? Like, so you're also kind of always like one traumatic event from changing your beliefs about everything. But I try to do my work as kind of like a strict materialist, but I'd be lying if I kind of said like I feel like super certain about that or don't oscillate back and forth. I think it'd be more proper to say that, like, instead of calling myself a Christian, like I am Christian, like I am like adjective, like formed by that environment, formed by that culture. That's where my thinking comes from, like, right. And as for like actual belief in a deity, in the traditional sense, no. In the non-traditional sense, all the time. It just looks different ways, right? So I always have to, every time I get asked that question, it's funny because I feel like the only way for me to answer honestly is to seem like I'm trying to dance around it, and I'm not trying to dance around it. I'm trying to directly say, no, I try not to, but actually I kind of do, right? So it kind of depends on what we mean about that. So, but also, I always kind of laugh that asking a theologian whether or not they believe in God is like the biggest taboo, right? Like that's the one thing you don't ask if you're ever like in a room of theologians. You never ask that, and you will always watch them like all kind of get skittish and like who's listening or whatever. So luckily my job doesn't require me to pretend to believe anything, so I can just kind of say that. So
and I respect that it's a more of a complicated answer because we're talking about God, and I think when it's just a simple yes or no, I immediately feel like, oh, so we're not talking about the same thing then, if your answer is simple to that question.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Well, and you always see like theologians and religious studies and types and like philosophers, we all kind of like, we understand it that question has a lot of space for nuance, right? Like it definitely does, right? But if we're kind of saying at the most basic level of like, how would a normal person just kind of abstracted from that conversation, how would they understand that question and what you're actually asking? The answer is no. But if we add like a little bit of philosophy and we say like, well, I don't know, like I do all sorts of things all day long that tie me into a system of absolute meaning and investment into objects and rituals and things like that. So like, what are you talking about, right? I occasionally even pray when I get into a bind, right? Like, so does that mean I like suddenly like believe in God or whatever? So yeah, it's just hard to say, right? So.
And so what are some of the ways that people who say they don't believe in God, when you look at their life or the way that they think and the way their beliefs function, there's clearly something going on there, that they believe in something?
I'm not sure I understand the question. Could you maybe
like how you had said, in a traditional sense you don't, but in a non-traditional sense all the time you're believing in something?
Oh yeah, well, I'm trying to think. Oh God. Well, okay. Well, like the stupidest sort of most banal example that I think it's probably used too much is like how someone would like leave faith and then like pick up yoga or like some sort of like mind-opening drug use or something like that, right? Like that's sort of like an easy thing to pick on, right? But like you've got your symbols, you've got your rituals, you've got your practices, community, various other things, right? But I even think, is a white evangelical like a Republican first and a Christian second, or a Christian first and a conservative? We can even get into spaces like that where we can talk about like whole political economies working as types of faith, right? Like if they've got their characters, their symbols, their creeds, their things that you absolutely must not break orthodoxy on. Like these all have like a very religious nature to it, right? Even the concept of, I think I was just using this example yesterday in class, but like even the concept of like the good, right? Like, am I a good person? Like, how do you measure up like whether or not you're a good person? Well, usually you're thinking of it in kind of like a very Platonic, like, here's my actions and do they measure up to this eternal form of the good, right? Which clearly doesn't exist, but that's absolutely theological when you're trying to figure out, or like, does this constitution or this law measure up to the ideal form of justice, right? Like that's absolutely theological, right? So we engage in this type of thing that really we have always called theology, and now we try to confine theology to just the realm of religious behavior. Guess what? Like religion is how people evolve to think, right? Yeah. Like religion is just like the way that we invest in symbols. So it's natural that infects our politics and our culture and our media and everything else, right? It's not very clear about like how you can divide off like what is religious or what is not. Even if it's explicitly secular, right?
Yeah. And you studied and done a lot of work through studying the psychoanalyst Jacques Lacan. And I wanted to read this quote to you and get your thoughts on it from Lacan, where he says, "And as long as things are said, the God hypothesis will persist." I'm going to continue, but I love that. As long as things are said, not certain, just things that are said, the God hypothesis will persist. That is why, in the end, only theologians can be truly atheistic, namely those who speak of God. Then he says, there is no other way to be an atheist except to hide one's head in one's arm in the name of I know not what fear. Yeah. So what are your thoughts on that? Or even for people who heard that and have no idea what he's talking about, can you break it down?
Is that Seminar 20 or is that the 20. Triumph in Seminar 20? Yeah. I love that idea that only an atheist or only a theologian can be a true atheist, actually. Well, what he's talking about is the way that a symbol or a signifier, in this case a word, is robbed of its meaning when it's spoken of and analyzed kind of like out in the open. And when you're talking about like how to analyze an idea or a word that represents a whole baggage, a whole tradition of thought, that kind of like neuters its like mysterious power, its tradition, right? And so like he's kind of saying like the theologians are the one who like get down into the details of like where does this idea come from, like how did it evolve over time, and then once you get into that, once you start tearing apart the signifiers, you realize that this one word that stands in for a million different words behind it, right, that are all kind of implied and sort of work this kind of nebulous unconscious force behind that word. Once you start like kind of deconstructing one behind the other or analyzing one behind the other, then you've suddenly robbed it of all its power, right? So like, so he's kind of, I guess in a way saying there's a kind of like that technical sense of like only an atheist or only a theologian can be a true atheist, because only the theologian is the one that looks at these words and robs them of their power by analyzing them, right? But I would also think at the same time, there's almost like a more intuitive kind of day-to-day truth that rings of like just how many people lose their faith while going through seminary, right? There's a sense of like just experiencing the stuff and like in analyzing it like causes it to lose some of its mystery, like lose some of its power, right? When you see something too up close. But I do think he does kind of say that, mankind, there's a similar quote in the book, The Triumph of Religion, where he says that in the war between psychoanalysis and Christianity wins. Absolutely, right? Christianity is able to repress in ways that we can't even begin to understand. It will win, right, in the grand scheme of things. And he's kind of pointing to this aspect of like human beings evolved to need certain symbols, and we evolved to like find meaning in this type of stuff. And so like the idea that it's going to go away when we've been performing symbolic, almost religious-esque or religious behavior or religion adjacent behavior for longer than we've been Homo sapiens, like the idea that it's going to suddenly go away is ridiculous, right? Mm-hmm. Like it's not going away. It's going to stay around for a while.
So do you think though that it would be possible for people to believe in a God that isn't all-powerful, sovereign, over controlling everything? Is that because part of me thinks that through studying and being honest, one could get past that, but then at the same time it feels like it's something that will continue to haunt us no matter what. Mm-hmm. What do you think?
I think it's possible. Are you talking about like God in the traditional sense, or like are you playing with that term? Like kind of like an open theist or like process type, like for example. No, I think that's definitely possible. I don't know if I think that that's helpful or not, but it's probably better than like the absolute sovereign God, right? Yeah. Or it might be like a baby step in the right direction, right? But I think that. Whether or not it's possible, absolutely. And I would have to say that it's possible because for most of our history, deities didn't take the shape of like the all-powerful being, right? We don't even have like an all-powerful being for like half of the Bible, right? Like half of the Bible was written before God was just the only God, right? So in the Hebrew Bible, we have these two gods, Elohim and Yahweh, who eventually during the Babylonian era, kind of get redacted into being one god. But the ancient traditions were that like these gods lived among other gods, right? And the Israelites were always getting in trouble for worshiping other gods in addition to them, right? Mm-hmm. There was a henotheistic culture, but that was nothing unusual there, right? Like the gods throughout time have always kind of lived in a plurality of other gods, right? I worship this god because that's what my family does, that's what my tribe does, but that's not because that's the only god, and that God certainly doesn't have all the power. It's just the one that I feel affiliation to. Right. So I think the idea of like a God being something less than all powerful is actually that's the normal way to think about gods in human history, right? It's just that for the last 2,000 years or so, we've tended to think of gods as more powerful with all the omni qualifiers and the sovereignty qualifiers and everything else. But that doesn't work, right? Like that sovereignty breaks down. Like it's an untenable concept at some point.
Do you think there's anxiety tied to people feeling like they need to believe in this all-powerful sovereign God?
Oh yeah. Well, I think that the way that Khan puts it, actually, I really like, is that he says kind of anxiety is this bipolar affect where the moment that I'm asking another an other what they want, or the moment that the other is asking of me, what do I want, right? This question, so what do you want, is like the ultimate anxious question. I always joke that like that's why like the most theologically and philosophically sophisticated film of all time is, of course, like The Notebook, right? Like, or like that scene, like, what do you want, right? Like, but that's the question, like, right, when you ask like your partner, like, what do you want, or when they ask you, what do you want, that's the question that kind of triggers anxiety, right? And it triggers anxiety because you kind of realize all the barriers to what you want are fictions, right? Like they're self-imposed at that point. And when you feel that barrier slipping away, now you have to take personal responsibility for what you want, right? So there's that question of like, so when we modulate that, not between like a friend or a significant other, but to like this projection of a God character, like what does the God want of me? Well, I can't quite tell. So that feels quite anxious, right? Or if the God is asking of me, like, what do you want? Why aren't you following me? Like, why aren't you performing up to some standard? Or like, why aren't you fulfilling some purpose that you have in this world or something? Those are all like sort of anxiety ridden affective states, right? And so, and that's where, like, I like what Tillich has to say about it, where he says that basically all religious symbols, what they do is they kind of take all sorts of different anxieties that are at work in the community, and they kind of channel them, right? It's like, so if two people take the Eucharist, one of them is a single mother who's just been evicted from her apartment, and another is like an anxious student studying transubstantiation, right? Or like whatever else, right? They can both take this one symbol and feel like kind of like alleviated in a sense, right? Like, so the symbol mitigates the anxiety, but also ties you into the community that requires you to feel anxiety that continually needs to be mitigated, right? Like through instantiating guilt or like expectations of what you should do, right? So like the system solves itself by tying you into a system that ensures you continually need to solve this problem of anxiety, right? Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay.
That makes me wonder, is
I
there...
don't want to ramble too much, but...
No,
yeah.
it's all valuable information. And I wonder, is there, therefore, belief in God possible without anxiety?
No, I don't think so, but I don't think that there's... I think, like, well, I don't think that that's a bad thing, though. So... The way that like Lacan would think about this is that that anxiety is the affect of all affects. Like anxiety is like the prime mover of everything, right? So I feel anxiety and I like check the stove, but I also like to make sure that the gas is turned off, right? But I also feel anxiety, and so I get to work today so that I can make something of myself in the world, or I like feel anxiety that I haven't like kept in touch with this person, and so I do something else, right? Or I feel anxiety, so I go to church, or like whatever else. Like the anxiety like does a lot of things, right? Like it's not a bad thing. If you don't feel anxiety, it's because in a technical sense, it's because you wouldn't feel like the other's injunction to like you wouldn't feel the other's question, what do you want, right? So if I'm just kind of like either sort of disconnected from culture altogether, and I'm just kind of like sitting in my house all day and doing nothing, or if I just don't care what other people think of me, then maybe I don't feel anxiety, right? Or if I have some sort of psychotic slip, maybe I don't feel anxiety, right? But if I don't feel any sort of anxiety, I'm not motivated to make any sort of change, right? So anxiety over a certain threshold we perceive as a bad thing, right? But we kind of think of anxiety as like a bad word, and I actually kind of think like maybe it's actually kind of like a good thing at a certain threshold, and it should ask us to like, why do we feel these commitments? Why do we feel the need to please these directions that we're given by other people? Why do we feel the need to ask others what they want of us and like submit to that, right? Like that's all like a healthy thing to do. But a world without anxiety at all would be a world that loses motion to desire anything. Right.
Yeah.
So I kind of think of, so even that, like, so somebody listening might kind of say, well, you're kind of playing with the meaning of anxiety and kind of meaning something closer to like a modus operandi or like some sort of drive or desire. And I am, and like in psychoanalytic literature, they're all kind of tied right together, right? You can't have drive without anxiety. So, right. So to me, it makes sort of intuitive sense to think that those are very connected.
And that reminds me of your work on the big other. Can you talk about what the big other is and how that functions?
Oh yeah, well, maybe I can start off with my favorite example from Lacan about that ties into anxiety. So let's just stick with this again for a moment. Is where he talks about this mirror phase where infants, at some point in their cognitive development, they start realizing that the image that they look at in a mirror is the same as them, right? Like they realize, like up until then, they kind of perceive themselves as kind of like a disconnected, well, it's hard to say because you can't ask it; they don't have language yet, but they presumably experience themselves as kind of like a disconnected affiliation of drives and desires and wanting things and getting things or whatever else. But at some precise moment, they look in a mirror and they realize that the infant that they see is also them, right? And like all of a sudden, this is what I look like. Mm-hmm. Oh, and then Lacan says, what's the first thing that the infant does every time, right? The very interesting maneuver that the first moment that the infant recognizes what they look like, they turn around and check in with their caregiver behind them to see if like the mother is saying like, yeah, that's really you, right? Good, smarty. Yeah, like in other words, Lacan says, how interesting is it that the first moment that we sort of have this awakening of ego and we realize what we look like, our first anxious question is to immediately turn around to the big other and ask it to ratify what we are clearly seeing in front of us, right? Yeah. It doesn't seem weird at all that an infant does that, right? If I did that today, if I looked in a mirror and like searched around and for another or like prayed to God, like, is this really what I look like? Like that would seem very weird, right? But in another sense, we do that all the time, right? Like I can check my credit score to see if I'm a good person, or I can ask my boss if I'm performing well, right? Like we do that all the time. Like I know exactly how I'm performing, but I want to check in with another to see if they think that I'm performing that same way. And the moment that just one person who represents a symbol of that domain of my life ratifies me, then I feel better, right? Even though my boss could just be lying to me. I could actually be doing shit, right? Or maybe I could be doing really good and my boss tells me I'm doing bad. Who am I going to believe? I'm going to believe the boss, right? Yeah. So like I'm going to feel like something's missing or I've been wronged or something like that, right? So we do this like big other thing, and it's always tied to anxiety, right? Like what does the other want? What does the other think of me? What does the other desire, right? And what the other desires is what I should desire, right? Which is very explicit in like Christian theology, right? Because like whatever the God wants is like the righteousness that I should also want, right? So my desire and the other's desire are supposed to be one and the same. And to the extent that I don't align my desire with the other's desire, then I'm unfaithful in some way.
Yeah, and I think it gets scary when we figure out what God wants from what our spiritual leader says that God wants. And then so it's just this messy thing where of a lot of trying to make sure that we're good, trying to make sure that we're perceived as good, trying to make sure the God that my leader told me about sees me as good. And it can get really messy really fast, and it seems like a lot of power structures that are keeping people anxious and afraid and trying to make sure they're perceived as good, right? Yeah, absolutely. And I like you haven't like specifically written about sovereignty, but at the same time, I feel like all this work on the big other easily relates with that. And then also you ended your or toward the end of your book, The Cynic and the Fool, you had said any theology that has something to say will conflict with the power structures from which it emerges. Yeah. I love that quote a lot. So can you talk about that kind of theology?
Yeah, well, I think that, if something has something to say, a new idea is going to fit in with whatever came before in some way to have some sort of rootedness, right? And then the question becomes, is this new idea going to mesh with the way that we think of things now in such a way that it kind of gets absorbed by the system, right? Or is this new idea going to challenge the system, right? We could think of like, well, I don't know. James Cone has been on my mind a lot recently because his recent passing, right? But when he writes, and also like I grew up in the same town that he started teaching at, and like that's like literally the beginning and the end of what we have in common, right? But like I think of his way of thinking about God as something that like very, very clearly conflicts with everything that comes before it in sort of white American theology, right? So like that's one example, but I would even think like this is our political dynamic is always this question of like when a group that has been oppressed wants to be recognized, what does like the liberal position try to do immediately? It tries to absorb that and make it part of its liberal cause, right? It tries to take this thing that is an outlier in the system that's clearly in a point of an oppression and tries to fit it in with this basically well-functioning machine that can just kind of keep churning out like the same sort of, very minor changes, but things remain basically the same, right? Like, so we see this like in our politics, we see this in our religion. But yeah, to me, I'm not interested in, it's a challenge as a teacher because at some point, like, I have to ask myself, like, am I willing to like teach something that will like cost me my job, even if it's something that I really believe in, right? So like every teacher has to think this, every professor, every pastor has to have this kind of thought, right? But is the direction of your thought, is it fitting into a current system that is basically well functioning and can like absorb this new thought, or is this something that the master doesn't want you to know, right? So Lacan has this phrase like, what does the master want? Like the master of a factory, like he doesn't really care about how things work. He just cares that things work, right? Like obviously he doesn't really care, like as long as things kind of run smoothly, right? So we always need to kind of be asking ourselves, like, are the ideas that we're playing around with, is this something that can get absorbed into a current way that society is done? Does this idea fit within a basically stable capitalist liberal framework of society? Or is this something sort of more radical that it might actually conflict with power structures and cause people to get angry about their certain privileges or the certain ways that things like work and they should work differently or something like that. So I don't know, is that kind of like, is it,
yeah.
Do you have any?
This idea of the manipulative way of pulling in the problems that minorities have into the ideology in order to keep their own thing going reminds me of YouTube over the last couple of years has been criticized a whole lot from the way that they're running things, the way they don't communicate well, a lot of people leaving the platform. And they did a campaign for supporting Black creators, and they did another campaign for supporting women creators. Yeah. But we also all know that the majority of their audience, their users, are white males. And so I saw immediately that like, oh, they just need more users. That's why they're saying support Black creators, support women creators. And, yeah, and I'm seeing that a lot, whether it's in politics or in media, especially a lot of the, like, when these big corporations say they support Black Lives Matter or they support Me Too and stuff like that, immediately just feels like, oh, you're just trying to make sure that they're your customers too. And so I'm seeing that a whole lot of even same with church of like, yeah, we support that too. Make sure you come on Sunday.
Yeah. Well, like I guess you'll release this later, but for people listening, you will remember that at the time we're recording this, Starbucks just had like closed for one afternoon to fix racism, right? So because of this incident where it was like two Black men were removed from a Starbucks, and what I thought was like almost as interesting as like the racism that was deployed in that store, and then like the sort of hilarious nature of like thinking like we can resolve something by like an afternoon training session where they like watched a video or something. Like almost as, and then like clearly this is like Starbucks trying to align themselves with like hashtag resistance and things like that. But I thought almost as interesting was I don't know if you saw this, but there was this troll, like this sort of like right wing troll that like put together like a like an image that like what like looked like Starbucks corporate logo, and it said like, from now on, any homeless person will be able to use our bathrooms at any time, no purchase necessary. And then it came out that like, of course, this was like a troll to kind of like play the part and say like, yeah, like you're pretending like you're okay with people just being in your stores, which is your big defense, but like actually you're not, right? It was one of these cases where like these absolutely like awful human being like troll types like kind of exposed the truth of like the basic liberal structure of like, we don't actually want to change that much. We definitely want to look like we're changing a lot, right? So I thought that was kind of an interesting way that played out.
Yeah, definitely. And I also see that a lot of people, a lot of ministers are trying to preach this message of a God who is all controlling, and preach it as if it's an idea that so therefore everything will be taken care of. But then you go through a trauma and realize that's not exactly what we're talking about here. And yet so many ministers, and we talked about this in our last episode, like the cynical side of it, of they're still going to preach it, even though they know that it's not exactly how things go. Actually, this reminds me, in an old church I was at, there's the pastor had this whole series about praying and reading all the scriptures about praying, like classic knocking on the door over and over, the parable, and of course it's going to be answered, and saying like, no matter what, if we keep praying, it's going to happen. And so I was fully believed it and took it seriously, kept praying and praying and praying. Nothing was happening. And then it got me to a point where I was like, okay, I'm going to have to do some things myself. I can't just be praying all the time. And I told him that. And as a way of like, maybe we should talk about this differently. And he said, well, if it led you to this place that you think is good, then it's still fine that we're saying this. And I said, yeah, but I got it through rejecting it. I was like, what are you talking about? And it was like, no, we're still going to say it, even though we know it's a little bit problematic, and we know, and also all these just keep praying and always have faith messages have always just led me to depression of like, so
yeah. Well, this is the kind of the problem of sovereignty is, right, that you immediately enter the old Epicurus paradox about like the problem of evil, right? God is either able but not willing to prevent suffering, in which case he's a monster, or he's willing but not able, in which case he's not a god, or he's able and willing, but then like, where does evil come from? Or he's neither able nor willing, and then like, what are we even talking about, right? Like, those are the basic four options you have. And the moment that you give, like, you attribute sovereignty or like some sort of like divine fix to this, you enter that problem and it's irresolvable, right? Like the best resolution of that is like the Bible's book of Job, where Job is basically afflicted with these sufferings, and he's given three basic answers by his friends. A, you did this because God is trying to punish you, or B, you did this because God is trying to teach you something, or C, others have it worse, so stop complaining, right? And those are the same three reasons people give to like explain our suffering today, right? Those three examples are still with us. Like, the universe is trying to teach you something, or you're getting punished for something, or like others have it worse, so stop complaining. But like, sort of Job's like position is like, God comes down and kind of says like, I don't have a good answer. Stop asking, right? I did some cool stuff back then, but I don't really have an answer for you. Here's some new stuff, right? Is a very unsatisfying answer to this question at the end of the book, right? But it's so like, God is represented as like very powerful, but not like sovereign, not ultimately able to answer even his like stupid friends' questions, right? So I think that's kind of, and that to me, that's like a very Jewish way to think about it, because like again, like all throughout the Bible, God is not sovereign, right? Like, God gets surprised by things, God changes God's mind, God has to like fight with other gods and stuff like that, right? So so like, whether or not we're going to go with like a theistic conception of the world, I think it's much more realistic to say that like, nobody has all control, right? Like nobody, and this is something even like that, going back to that Schmidt quote earlier, he also has this axiom of like, I mean, he's probably, aside from quote about like how all significant political concepts of state today are secularized theological concepts. His other most famous quote is, "Sovereign is he who decides the exception," right? Like, you're the sovereign if you get to proclaim the executive order or the clemency or whatever else. Like, that's what sovereignty is. But we live in a world today where like the sovereign is the one who's able to sow chaos. like our sovereigns in the world like don't have absolute control. Like, that's not how the world works. If you are able to cause a lot of chaos and I don't know, maybe provide exceptions to rules, but like nobody in the world has all control. Like, that's not how we think of sovereignty. We think of sovereignty as the one who's able to act in a certain way, right? So we have this concept of a God who can have absolute sovereignty over everything, but that doesn't work philosophically. Again, like, problem of evil is one reason it doesn't work. It doesn't work for a lot of reasons. But like, that's also just, there's no other place in the universe where we use that concept of sovereignty, right? Yeah. Like, when we talk about a nation state being sovereign, we don't talk about it being sovereign. We don't mean that word anywhere close to like what we mean when we attribute it to God. Like, so it's just not a helpful concept. It's really ridiculous. It just doesn't line up with our experience.
Yeah, and the more I think about this, the more I'm feeling like a God without sovereignty isn't that new, or rather, it's not brand new. We're deciding, everyone's always believed in a God with sovereignty, and we're deciding not to from now on. But rather, this is something that came late in the belief in God, as we had said earlier, and really, and it seems also to the part of the reason it came late in the belief in God is because monarchs came late in human civilization and religion, and so it feels like, I keep feeling like it's a lot of our modern ideas, traditional ideas of God, are really modeled off of monarchs of the past.
Yeah. Actually, like on the first day of religion classes, God, this could be a whole episode to itself. But I do tell my poor students on the first day of like a religion class that we're going to talk about how the facts that monotheism, intercontinental empires, and money were all invented in the same place in the world within about 100 years of each other. And I tell them, you're going to have to decide by the end of this class if you think that's just weird random chaos or if that might have something to do with each other, right? Of course, the truth is like, yes, like the monotheistic concept of God was modeled off a monarch, but also in Hebrew tradition, right, like the gods Yahweh and the god Elohim were merged together while under captivity under one of those monarchs with those intercontinental empires, right? And in intercontinental empires, because you have to send armies far off, like they started being able to like stamp money and carry it with soldiers so that they could provision themselves, so they didn't have to have like these thousands of miles long supply lines, right? Like so we get like the monarch, the intercontinental empire, the monotheism, and the money all at the same time in the same place, right? It's like to me that's a very interesting relationship between them, right? And so it's not that surprising that like the absolute sovereignty of the monarch gets transferred to the god, which also gets transferred to the coin, right? Like they're all sort of the same thing, but at the same time, like, under what conditions is sovereignty ever considered a good thing? Like what nation has ever had a true sovereign, right? We can maybe name a few tyrants who got close, but like we don't think of that as a good thing. We also wouldn't think of it as like a good thing if like money had absolute sovereignty. Like the closest thing that has anything close to sovereignty is like math or physics, right? And that's only good because it provides a limiting principle or a calculating principle, right? Like it's nothing to worship, right? So yeah.
And when would you say that 100 years took place where all those things happened?
I'm in a blank on it right off the top of my head. It's somewhere in the like 7th, 6th century. Right. So money occurs. It gets independently invented by China like about 100 or so years later, or before. I can't remember if they invented it before or after. And then it starts popping up in Lydia, which is sort of like modern day Turkey area. And spreads into Persia pretty quick. And so it had to do with like all this infighting between like the Greeks and the Persians and these other sort of lesser empires that pop up in between those. So money. That's another thing that I kind of explain to students, like when we're thinking about like the role that money has as like a theological dimension, is like our species is 200,000 years old. We only invented money about like 2,700 years ago, max, right? Maybe less. We've actually had writing for almost twice as long as we've had money. Yeah. So money has only been around for between 1% and 2% of our history as a species. So it's interesting to think how ingrained it gets into the psyche of how we regulate our lives, right? So at least when I say money, I mean coined money, right? Like there's other ways to think about what money is and how that transfers across trade cultures.
Mm-hmm. I mean, would you have any advice for someone who's feeling like they feel like there's something, like they're starving for some sort of spirituality, but they can't believe in the God that their church told them about, this almighty sovereign God? And do you have any advice for someone who's on that journey searching something out?
I feel like the person who is feeling that way should not be afraid to travel down that path, right? Mm-hmm. Like what do you have to lose? Mm-hmm. Like why is that a bad thing? Like why do we need to worry about that? I'll tell you, the reason we do worry about that and feel stress about it is because we're really, really used to having the big other tell us what we should want, right? If you're like in a relationship and all you desire is what your partner desires, you're in an abusive relationship, right? Like if you're not allowed to like think through like, what do I desire? That's problematic, right? So like, if you're starting to feel that about like how you think about religion, like why would you not take the risk of traveling down that path and like seeing where that goes, right? You might end up back in the same place, but like you might end up in a lot better place, right? It will be at the least, it will be like something that is more you. Like the way that I do like how Lacan thinks about like ethics, like that's kind of like how it changed the way that I think about theology, where he says like it's really difficult in psychoanalysis to say what ethics is, because psychoanalysis kind of assumes that like what we call ethics is like repression, right? Like repression of sort of our base instincts so that we can all live together in a society. But he says, I can tell you like what ethics probably shouldn't be is like the desire of the other, or the desire of the big other. Like you can't just export your responsibility for how I want to live in the world onto somebody else who can tell me how I should behave, right? Then you've simply like abandoned your responsibility to think about how to interact in the world. And I kind of think that like maybe we need to think about theology in the same way. Like I can't constructively tell you what the correct ethics or the correct theology is going to be, but I can tell you this: it's not going to be what another tells you have to believe, right? It's not going to like it's not the desire of the other, right? So the moment that you feel that pressure of like ethics is the desire of the other, your life should just conform to the desire of the other. Your theology should conform to the desire of the other, whether we're talking about like desire of your partner, which is abusive, or the desire of your pastor, which is abusive, or whatever else. Like just that's a red flag all the time, right? The moment that you're being told to conform to the desire of the other, right? Which is not to say that we like need to go off the rails and like do like whatever, right? Like it's a call for responsibility. It's a call to like accept that challenge and to think through like, why do I want to see the world this way? Do I really want to see it this way?
And actually, I just realized too that in the last episode how you had said when you were going through such trauma and rethinking a lot of how you thought, you wrote a book. Would you say that writing has a huge part to play in going through that journey?
Oh, yeah. To me, writing is like a return of the repressed, right? Like to me, it's a way to kind of deal with something and get it out there. And so to me, it's like, it looks like book writing. For normal people, it looks like journaling, right? Yeah, of course. But it also looked like at the time, like when I was sort of going through my darkest moments, it also like manifested in lots of drinking and like cigarettes and stuff too, right? Like it definitely evolved. It definitely manifested as like unhealthy things too, that I had to like sort of subtract from my life afterwards, right? But to me, like if you can take like trauma and turn it into creativity, like why would you not, right? Like so So to me, that's a good thing, right? Like why not travel down that path and see where it goes?
I think that's great advice too. Of like turn it into something, write something, make something. Haven't you made electronic music in the past too?
I used to make quite a bit of music, actually. Yeah. So we call that sublimation. Actually, it's the same as a repression, right? But you can either repress your desires and keep them down and turn it into something bad for you, or you can sublimate it and turn it into art. I used to sing and play, and I even did some like electronic stuff as well. So I don't make much music anymore, though. I just kind of spend all my time writing and reading. So
right.
it seems to feel like a little bit more me. So
and you're still sublimating, but just through other ways.
Yeah, just in different ways. Yeah,
definitely. I relate, right? Because I used to make music too, and now I do a lot of this stuff.
Okay.
So thank you so much, and you're
thanks
working on another book.
Yep.
So can you tell us about that again?
Yeah, the book is tentatively called Turmoil and Resonance. What does the white evangelical want? I don't. That name might get changed according to like what a publisher's desires. Again, like and everything is for the desire of the other. It's going to be a book. It's like in 5 or 6 chapters, and each one kind of looks at something that it's basically all came out of like a lot of liberals asking me like, I don't get like why white evangelicals like get so excited about like racism or like why they don't believe in public education, or like what's the deal with like rejecting climate science, right? So I try to take like for example, like the opening chapter on like climate collapse and like that being like the actual greatest threat our civilization has ever faced. How does that work with a culture in which 1 in 3 Americans believe the world ends with Jesus coming back sometime in this century, right? Like, so what's the relationship between those two? Where does that like historically come? How does it get amplified by propaganda? So I do that for like climate science, education, sexuality, media, and then kind of have like a study on like populism and fascism towards the end. So, so that's what I'm working on. It's been very dark. It's been kind of depressing, but it's also very exciting. And I wish I didn't feel like I was interested in things that were so unfortunately current. So
I definitely relate.
Yeah.
All right, so thank you so much, and I would love to have you back on another time to keep talking about all these ideas.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, let's stay in touch.
All right, thank you. I'll see you later.
All right.
Bye-bye.
Thanks.
All right, there we go. What'd you think about that interview, Gabby? Gabby's back, by the way. Here she is.
I'm back. It was, man, my brain really liked listening to that in so many different directions. Like I like the way he speaks about things because it's very easy to digest, and it's very easy to relate to certain aspects of your life, and so it's cool. It gets you thinking.
Yeah, I related also a lot with, and I loved when he was talking about how when people go into seminary, so many lose their belief in God or become non-religious or become atheist or just feel like, or at the very least feel like Christianity maybe isn't the only way or whatever. But I experienced that as well, going through different, like I did a church internship and I was taking Bible college classes, and just when you're in an environment where you're constantly analyzing this stuff, you realize how deconstructible it is. And when you realize how deconstructible something is, you realize it's kind of not actually God. And I've seen in so many of those settings where they're teaching theology, it's like this idea of God clearly is a mystery, but here's a chunk of the mystery that we can understand, and that's what we're going to teach you. But when we talk about it like that, plenty of people realize this chunk that you say we can understand is extremely deconstructible, easily able to realize, oh, that part of the idea was started in this year and that part of the idea was started from that person, easily deconstructible. And then that could lead them to say, okay, then the whole mystery is false. Or, which is a journey I've been through after a lot of deconstruction, realizing that chunk that you said we can understand is deconstructible. Therefore, the whole thing then is a mystery instead of this idea of here's the chunk that's understandable.
Yeah. I think that's really interesting because I tie that back to like my history with going to church is when I grew up, here in Santa Maria, and there's a lot of different types of churches here. Mm-hmm. They're all, pretty either Catholic, Christian, or I think that's kind of it. Or
it's like one Orthodox church.
Basically, like there's a Mormon church, and I've actually been to. When I was little, I would go to church with my friends, and I would go to a different church every weekend. So I've been to most of the churches in town, even the Mormon church.
Yeah,
I actually went. I was invited to one time. That was a really interesting experience. But it's interesting because I did it to experience like other people's beliefs, but I never like bought into the belief system myself. And I kind of just decided that it like that was cool, like, and that I didn't have to believe what other people believed, but that I could observe it kind of objectively. And I started doing that from like 6 to like I stopped going maybe around like 12. And it is very interesting because you run into a lot of different roots of deconstruction, like a lot of different perceptions of deconstruction. And I think that's where I realized like, man, this is humans' interpretation of a greater source. So why put a specific label and call it right? And that's kind of something I found with spirituality in general. It's not even necessarily about, people don't make it about belief a lot of the time. They make it about being right. Yeah. And that's kind of almost like a disease that I think societies have is the need to be right instead of the want or yearning to learn or grow or even create understanding of good and bad or anything. It's basically like the need to be right and have the thing that you think is right above everything else. And which is interesting because when you look at the concept of doing things for the desire of the other person or, needing that affirmation, kind of unless you already think you're right. Yeah. People only do that when they have like the anxiety factor or the thing that drives them through their passion or whatever they're doing, unless they already think they're right. And I think it's just something to observe, I think, in our communities.
Definitely. And that makes me think too how the very, very necessary path of deconstruction, I think everyone needs to go through that, and then throughout life just have that healthy deconstruction throughout their own journey. But that path I've seen starts in different ways, and sometimes it starts, I think in my case it started realizing the beliefs I grew up with all failed me. And in other cases, like your case, you just listen to other people's beliefs and realize, oh my gosh. And that's, people have seen the pluralism, which is simply just interacting with people who believe differently, actually makes religion go down in society because they start to realize, oh, there's plenty of ways of talking about this stuff. Maybe what I was taught has some problems. Right. So there's different ways to enter into deconstruction. But I also really I wanted to bring this up because Tad DeLay just totally said this super casually, and people who grew up in church may thought, is he lying here? When he said that there's 2 gods in the Old Testament, in the Hebrew Bible, especially in the beginning, Elohim and Yahweh. And if you've ever read the Bible, it's not clear that there's 2 gods that they're talking about at all. But here's the thing. He's not lying. He really was getting that from the Bible. The thing is, the Old Testament is written in Hebrew and a little bits in Aramaic, but the whole thing in Hebrew when referring to God, gives God different names, and the two main ones are Yahweh and Elohim. But in English, Yahweh translates to the Lord and Elohim translates to God. So when we're just reading it straight through in English, we just hear one passage says, and then God said, and then another passage says, the Lord said. And we just think those are just interchangeable for the same person or whatever. And it's interesting if we actually read it as kind of two different figures, and we realize especially the first 5 books of the Bible, it's clearly not just written by one person straight through, but several different documents that someone collected all together. And scholars have been able to realize, okay, these sections are written about a God named Elohim. These sections are written about a God named Yahweh, and someone just collected them together and put them together. And you see that just straight up from the first couple chapters. Genesis 1 is talking about Elohim creating the world. Genesis 2 gives a second creation narrative, but it's talking about Yahweh creating the world. And so that's
so interesting.
Yeah, and it's all put together, and it's I think what's extremely important to understand, though, which is why we bring all this up, is because polytheism, the belief in many gods, was first. Hinduism and Sumerian religions, which kind of was related to that, was first before everything. And so, and I think, and it's the same with old, ancient, indigenous, native religions, because religion started with people looking at forces of nature and saying, that's a god, that's a god, that's a god. That there's the god of the sky, there's the god of the water, there's the god of sand, whatever. And it's and so that was just the first ideas of God. And then as time went by, it became tribal of, well, here's our sets of gods and here's their sets of gods. And then with ancient Israel, they very much, you could see by their language, they don't strictly ever directly say it, but by their language, you could tell they believe there are other gods, but they just have their God, which is why, like, one of the 10 Commandments is, you shall have no other God besides me. It's like implying that there's other gods. And so for Israel, in the beginning, when there were tribes, it was like, there's their gods, there's that tribe's God, there's that nation's God, that family's God, here's ours. And then as monarchies came into play, which was now the idea of one guy above everyone else, their beliefs changed and religion started to reflect that idea, and monotheism started to come into play. And so they said, okay, there is only one God and all those other gods are demons. And then over time, it was like, okay, no, there's only one God and there's nothing else supernatural that exists. And that clearly reflects, okay, there's only one king, there's only one emperor who's going to control all the other empires in the world, and that's it. And so... And
then there's only one way to have currency.
Yeah, there's only one currency.
Way to have currency.
One way to buy and sell things.
Yeah, money.
Yeah, so it like... I love that, because we're not trying to get everyone to become atheists by saying this. We're trying to get everyone to realize that there are other ways to talk about God, and the ways we talk about God today, we can point you to the places in history of why and how they started.
Right. Yeah.
And hopefully that opens you up more to the mystery.
And maybe even find your own path with it, because I think you can definitely take like the history that we know and find a route, or you could go deeper and try and research history that isn't popular, that people don't know about, like why they believe there's a God for fire and wind and earth, because somebody came and taught them that, some type of person or being or something, like, ignited literally that fire within humans to create that belief system. And it's kind of just interesting because we have consciousness and expression, and that's kind of what our lives are, expressing our consciousness and being curious, because our consciousnesses are curious and then they express, and then they're curious and they express, and we kind of life is all of the details of that. And we can continue to deepen our curiosity and our expression through learning. And I think questioning things, I wanted to touch on the anxiety thing for a minute, because I've never heard anxiety kind of thought about that way, because in our generation specifically, like millennials and before, or who's after us,
Generation Z,
Y and Z. I don't
we're
know.
Y.
We're Y. Okay, I don't know. Whatever those letters are. Anxiety is like kind of an epidemic. We're like all freaking out all the time, and it's like getting like the reins on that thing is such like it's like an impossible task, it seems like, for almost everybody. And for those of us who have seemed to have like a handle on it or whatever, people look to like it's impossible or whatever. But I love how he said that, anxiety could be looked at as a positive thing. And
because without anxiety, the world would stop moving, basically. We would no longer be in motion.
Yeah, and like how he kind of related it to desire or purpose. And like, I think if you look at it like on an energy standpoint, like anxiety, excitement, purpose, drive, they all kind of resonate at a certain frequency, and I'm sure those frequencies are very similar. It's just how we perceive the words themselves. So I think that anxiety within ourselves, we don't have to perceive as bad. We can perceive that frequency, that resonation within ourselves in kind of a different way and kind of more purpose-driven, and let that be a catalyst or a catapult even to boost us up and fly us across to where we want to go.
Yeah. And he gets a lot of that idea of anxiety from Jacques Lacan, who, and other times he talks about the idea of anxiety as kind of like our body's alarm system, in a way of like, we have to, instead of trying to avoid our anxiety, figure out what is our anxiety trying to tell us. Because usually it's because there's something unhealthy going on within us, and in order for our body to try to get us to realize it, it gives us anxiety. And so we have to there's definitely an aspect to it that we have to pay attention to in order to, and when we just avoid the anxiety, push away the anxiety, it just stays and gets stronger. But when we address the thing that the anxiety has come for, then that we move toward healing. And
then I think some people are like, well, I have anxiety, but I have no idea why. I think that's a good bell or alarm to maybe check in with yourself, because maybe you're numbing some things, or you're just maybe not conscious or aware of what you're creating in your life. And if you have any type of unhappiness or health issues, or like your relationships with people aren't the best they could be, or the relationship with yourself isn't the best that it could be, then I think anxiety is going to ring its bell and let you know, like, hey, you could do some movement here. Because I think, instead of looking at it as good or bad, you could look at it as movement, as growth in a certain direction, in whatever direction you want to perceive it, or want to create it as, rather. So, I would. That's my advice.
Yeah, definitely. That's extremely important, and avoiding anxiety can turn into like the anxiety of not knowing what to do in the world. Can just we try to numb it by, okay, I'll just do what my parents want me to do, or I'll just do what my partner wants me to do. And that can turn into, I'll just do what this projection of God that I have wants me to do. It's conforming the desire to the other. And I love how when he said you cannot export how you should be in the world on someone else. And ethics shouldn't be just conforming to the desire of the other or the big other. And it made me think of how plenty of statistics have showed us that atheists are usually more ethical in their decisions than religious people. And I think this is why, like, we've been able to see that atheists donate to charities more, atheists do community service more, they give their time more. And so and I think that's because they're not putting their ethics onto something else or someone else. They're able to actually stop and think about what they think is actually good to do in the world. And it's funny, like there's like a classic old like fundamentalist Christians, and it's kind of a joke to everyone else, but we might have heard before fundamentalist Christians say things like, well, if there wasn't a God, then I would just go out and kill and abuse people. And that's why I believe in God, or that's why everyone else should believe in God. And it's like, what? That's what's stopping you from doing those bad things, is your belief in God. And that's what it is. It's like conforming your desire to the other. And so it's like being able to break out, like Gabby was saying, out of that abusive relationship is so important. And to be able to see how problematic that can be when it's just constantly like, what should I do? And like, I remember Barry Taylor, who we interviewed before, in an old talk, he had said how he had students come up to him kind of like scared and anxious, saying like, I'm like worried, like what if God wants me to go to Africa and I don't think I could do that, and what if God sends me there? And then he was like, well, why would he? You don't want to go to Africa. He's going to send someone who wants to. Why are you so worried and scared about that? And I grew up in that environment. It was just this constant worry and fear of like, what is God going to tell me to do? What if God tells me to do something that I don't want to do?
It's like a toxic relationship. And I don't know if this is something radical to say, but like, I believe that your relationship with God is a direct, and vice versa, a direct mirror of your relationship with yourself. Yeah. And, if you're having a lot of that worry or stress come up, like check in with yourself. How much are you loving yourself? Because that's how much you're loving your God. How much are you appreciating yourself? That's how much you're appreciating your God. Like, you should be a reflection of that belief, because that is your moral compass, right? That's like where you're operating your belief systems are at. We kind of touched on this in the last interview, but like, how much does it actually play into your life? Is God just something that you see on church on Sunday and then have no, have no inkling with for the rest of the week, Or is it something that you think about like often with every word that you say? Because I think when you break it down, like how you operate should be a direct correlation with your belief system, if you're aligning yourself with it, because otherwise you're actually not really believing in what you say you're believing in. Yeah. Right. So I think cultivating a good relationship, like if people don't know where to start with their belief systems and God or whatever you want to call it, I think the best place to start is with yourself, like with your own heart, create your own moral compass, and like, then maybe find a community that can help you support that and grow that, and maybe even find cool new ideas to, elaborate on. But I mean, and it can be expressed in infinite amounts of ways, but that's just kind of one that if you're feeling stuck, that can help. Yeah,
definitely. And for my own personal beliefs, I feel like if God actually is a being with a personality, this God is probably a lot more like the God of Job in that book, Job, and that we briefly mentioned. With those that don't know, that starts with basically in this story, God and Satan making a bet. Satan saying, "I bet you if I take away everything that Job has, he'll deny you and curse you." And God is like, "Bet," and then they do it, and then Job doesn't reject and curse God, but he's suffering and struggling and like super confused and saying, why God, why have you done this to me? I've lost everything. And then he's surrounded by his 3 friends who all have a reason for him. Like maybe you're sinning and God's punishing you. Maybe you might be sinning but not knowing you are, or maybe whatever. And then someone else will like, oh, well, other people have it worse. Like they all have this perfect meaning for why God is doing what God is doing for Job. And then the end, God comes and is basically like, you're all wrong. And it goes into this long thing of, like Tad worded it as like, well, look over there and look at that thing. But he says, where were you when I formed the foundations of the earth? And then he says, where were you when I created this thing? Where were you when I created that beast of the sea? Where were you when I created that thing in the air? Where were you when I birthed ice caps out of my womb? And it's like, and then at the end, Job is like, now I've seen God. When all this God did was in the context, in the midst of all these people saying, God does this because of this, God points to the chaos of nature and says, really? You think you know how everything works? You think you know how I work, why everything happens? Look at how chaotic nature is.
Yeah.
This is how it actually is. And I think the reason I would believe more in that type of God is because that type of God makes way more sense in the context of the suffering of the world. And this God is like part of the suffering of the world and says like the chaos that we all experience every day is actually part of it, not a weird bug in the system.
Yeah. And if we look past our bodies, like if we're all a spark of God,
yeah,
and we all have our own little personalities, you know, if we all come together, like to go back to that source, that that original place that we're sparked from, like, why wouldn't we make up one huge funny personality? You know?
Exactly. That's exactly what we did.
Like what? So God made like mountains, but he also made like really weird things like succulents. Uh-huh. Like, you know, what a funny woman.
Exactly.
I just feel like, yeah, I just feel like it's just so infinite. Like, why try to confine it to any type of thing? Like it being I think, okay, I'm going to touch on something happening currently. I think there's a funny thing going on where it's like God is a woman, which is why I said that. But it's less the belief that God is actually a woman and more the belief that like God could be literally anything.
Right.
God doesn't even have to be like what we perceive as human or have a gender. But we like have to conform things into this little belief structure so that we can like perceive it and hold it in our hands when really it is our hands. Like, you know, it is the box that we create. It is everything outside and inside, and it all fits into each other. Like, so like, yeah, I think trying to define things in general is just kind of silly, but I mean, we kind of have to do it because
it's just our attempts.
Right now we have language to express ourselves. But who's to say we can't express ourselves? Well, and we express ourselves in other ways, like music or whatever. But yeah, language, like words and our perception of words becomes so interesting because words are literally just tiny boxes that we shove some perception into and hope that everybody can perceive that same word in the same general way so that we can communicate. But yeah, it's funny because then when you get into like deconstructing God or just, you know, theories in general, words they matter a lot, but then they also like don't matter at all.
Yeah.
So it's almost like we're just trying, all we're trying to do all the time, all humans ever try to do is project the same image in somebody else's mind that we have in our own heads. And same with belief systems. And same with, that's like, goes back to the concept of being right. And it's just because we have these certain little expressions in our head that want to communicate. And yeah.
Yeah, one of my favorite Friedrich Nietzsche quotes is who's an atheist, said the only reason we're not rid of God is because we still believe in grammar. I love that so much.
So good.
Like,
That's so funny.
like you're just acknowledging that, like, I wish we could get rid of God, but like it's not going to go away because of words.
Well, and I feel like say we even evolved to escape, like physically speaking, and that we can just like telepathize things to each other. Like, I think instead of being rid of God, like for me, that would take us even closer, you know, because that now we're like, instead of being a tiny little spark, we're like a little bit bigger, and we can understand a little bit more. And like, I think that's kind of humans, like as we progress, if we have a goal for like Earth, for our lives, for each other, for if we let our anxiety help direct us into our purpose-driven ways, then we can't evolve, because we've seen it. We've done it throughout history. And I think that evolution, if we have like an actual goal for it, like I want to be closer to God, like we can literally evolve in ways that will help us actually be closer to our perception of God.
Right. And this is what I mean, how deconstruction can actually help us have a deeper interaction with God. And like another example of language is, I remember reading a long time ago that in almost every single language, when they're coming up with words for colors, blue is usually the last word they come up with, because blue is like, first off, like one of the hardest colors to make, and you can't really like point to something to say that's blue. And before they have the word blue, when they like, we all immediately think, well, the sky is blue. They don't perceive it as blue. They perceive it as like grayish or something. And then when they have the word blue, like, okay, that's blue. And so, but breaking that down doesn't lead us to say, okay, then color doesn't exist. But breaking that down makes us realize, oh, there's a deeper way to understand things that transcends these different categories.
And that's really interesting too, because now we know scientifically, when you look at a color, you're actually seeing every other color than that color. The color is actually just our perception, because it's like, there's some, you can look it up. There's more science. I can't explain it that well. I'm not here because I'm good at science. We'll say that.
Same here. But yeah, it's definitely, I harping so much on this deconstruction thing because so many people grow up in environments where they say, if you want to be closer to God, don't ask questions, don't deconstruct, don't doubt, whatever. But I very much believe like this is what leads us closer to it, which is why we're talking about a God without these concepts of sovereignty. So you can see that there's so many ways to talk about this that leads you to a deeper faith. So that's what we're doing. There we go. You have fun?
Yeah, that was so much fun. If you guys heard like, if it sounds like there's a tower crumbling in the background, it's just my tortoise rubbing up against the house.
Yeah.
Knocking it over.
Giant tortoise. All right, so thank you guys for listening. Check us out, godtalkpod.com. Follow us on Instagram and Twitter at godtalkpod, and we'll see you next week.
This was fun.
Okay, bye.